European Front, November 1944, a field somewhere in eastern France. The Sherman tank sat in the mud like a corpse. Rain had been falling for 3 days. The metal was black with soot and oil. The left track hung loose. The turret was frozen at a wrong angle. 3 holes punched through the front armor where German shells had found their mark. Sergeant Mike Donovan stood beside the wreck with a flashlight in one hand and a wrench in the other. He was 32 years old. Before the war, he had fixed tractors on a farm in Iowa. Now he fixed tanks. Or tried to. The smell hit you first. Burned paint, diesel fuel, something chemical from the fire suppression system. Then the cold November rain in France went through your jacket and into your bones. Captain Harris stood 10 feet back with his arms crossed. It's scrap. Donovan, strip it for parts and move on. We need those components for the other machines. Donovan said nothing. He walked around the tank slowly, checked the engine compartment, looked at the suspension, put his hand on the armor where it was cracked but not penetrated. The crew had bailed out 2 days ago when the transmission seized during a retreat. German 88s had found the disabled tank within minutes. 3 direct hits. The crew survived. The tank did not. Or so everyone thought. Donovan crouched beside the broken track. Rain dripped off his helmet. He could see how the drive sprocket had shattered, how the return rollers were bent, how the whole left side of the running gear was twisted. But the engine was intact. The main gun worked. The turret ring could be freed. The armor was compromised, but not destroyed. His hands were cold. His back hurt from days of working in the rain. The company was moving out in 48 hours. Captain Harris wanted this tank cannibalized for parts to keep the other Shermans running. Donovan looked at the holes in the armor again, looked at the angle of impact, looked at where the shells had gone through and where they had not. He stood up, walked back to the captain. "Give me 2 days." "For what?" "I can get it running." Harris stared at him. "Running?" "Donovan, that tank took 3 direct hits. The transmission is gone, the track is destroyed, the armor is Swiss cheese. I can fix it." "Fix it how? We don't have parts. We don't have time. We don't have—" "I don't need parts from supply," Donovan said. "I need parts from the other wrecks, and I need 2 days." The captain was quiet for a moment. Rain drummed on the metal around them. "You're insane." Donovan nodded. "Probably. If you waste 2 days on this and we lose a functional tank because we stripped it for your project, I'm putting you on report." "Understood, sir." Harris walked away, shaking his head. Donovan turned back to the broken Sherman. 48 hours. He'd need help. He'd need tools. He'd need luck, but he'd seen worse machines brought back from worse damage. Not by following the manual, by ignoring it. He pulled out a notebook and began sketching. The American tank battalions had been bleeding machines for months. Shermans were reliable. Shermans were easy to maintain. Shermans could be produced in massive numbers, but Shermans were not built to fight Panthers and Tigers. German armor was heavier. German guns were bigger. A Panther could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's shells bounced off. The math was brutal. For every German heavy tank destroyed, the Americans lost 3 or 4 Shermans, sometimes more. Supply tried to keep up. Replacement tanks came from the ports. Spare parts came in trucks. But the front moved faster than the logistics chain. Repair units worked around the clock and still fell behind. Mechanics learned to improvise. They pulled parts from knocked-out tanks. They fabricated pieces in field workshops. They violated every regulation in the manual because the manual assumed you had parts and time you had neither. Sergeant Mike Donovan had a reputation in the battalion. The other mechanics called him the mad mechanic. Sometimes they said it with respect, sometimes they said it with concern. He had kept tanks running that should have been abandoned. He had rebuilt transmissions with parts from 3 different wrecks. He had once gotten a Sherman moving again by replacing a damaged final drive with components from a destroyed German half-track. The engineering made no sense on paper, but it worked. His commanding officers tolerated him because his solutions kept armor in the field. His fellow mechanics either learned from him or stayed out of his way. The tank crews loved him because he brought their machines back from the dead. But there were limits. Everyone knew there were limits. A tank with catastrophic damage to the hull was scrap. A tank with a destroyed engine and no replacement was scrap. A tank that had taken multiple penetrating hits was scrap. That was doctrine. That was common sense. That was how the army worked. Donovan had never cared much for doctrine. He believed machines could be saved if you understood them well enough, if you saw past what they were supposed to be and looked at what they actually were. If you stopped thinking about regulations and started thinking about physics, a Sherman was not one machine. It was dozens of systems working together: engine, transmission, suspension, armor, gun, turret. If one system failed, you didn't throw away the whole tank, you fixed the system, or you replaced it, or you redesigned it. The other mechanics thought he was crazy because he spent too much time thinking he would stare at a broken component for an hour before touching it. He would sketch modifications in his notebook when he should have been sleeping. He would test ideas that made no sense to anyone else. But his ideas worked more often than they failed. Now he stood in the rain looking at a tank that everyone else had written off 3 penetrating hits, broken track, seized transmission, no spare parts available. Everyone else saw scrap metal. Donovan saw a puzzle. Mike Donovan had grown up in Iowa on a farm that was always one season away from bankruptcy. His father raised corn and hogs. His mother kept the books and prayed the numbers would work out. They never quite did. By the time Mike was 12, he was fixing tractors. Not because he wanted to, because paying a mechanic was impossible. The John Deere dealer was 40 miles away and charged rates the family couldn't afford. So Mike learned by doing. He took apart engines. He studied how parts fit together. He made mistakes and learned from them. By 15, he could diagnose most mechanical problems by sound. By 18, he could rebuild a tractor transmission in a day. He learned that machines were honest. They didn't lie. They didn't pretend. If something was broken, there was always a reason. Find the reason and you could fix the problem. People were harder. He joined the army in 1942. Not out of patriotism particularly. The farm was failing and there were no jobs. The army paid steady wages and promised technical training. They made him a mechanic, sent him to armored maintenance school, taught him about tank engines and transmissions and suspensions. Then they shipped him to Europe and told him to keep the Shermans running. He was good at it, better than most. He understood that a tank was just a tractor with a gun. The same principles applied: internal combustion, power transmission, track and suspension, oil and metal and heat. But there was one difference. When a tractor broke down, crops didn't get planted. When a tank broke down, men died. He had seen it happen. A transmission failure during a retreat. The crew trapped inside while German guns found the range. He had pulled bodies out of that tank, young men, younger than him. He had known their names, had worked on their machine the week before, had told them the transmission was getting worn and needed replacement parts that supply didn't have. They had joked about it, said they'd be careful, said they'd make it work. They didn't make it work. After that, Donovan stopped joking about mechanical problems. He stopped accepting "we don't have parts" as an answer. He stopped following the manual when the manual got people killed. He started thinking differently, started seeing solutions that didn't exist in the regulations. Started modifying and improvising and rebuilding in ways that made the other mechanics uncomfortable. Some called it genius. Some called it recklessness. Donovan didn't care what they called it. He cared about keeping crews alive. Now he stood in the rain looking at a tank that had almost killed its crew, a tank that command wanted stripped for parts, a tank that by every reasonable standard was beyond saving. He thought about the crews in the other tanks, thought about what would happen when they met German armor again, thought about the odds. Then he thought about what this wreck could become if he stopped thinking about what it was supposed to be. His hands were cold. The rain kept falling. He opened his notebook and began writing a list of modifications. The Sherman M4A3 serial number 3054297 had been built in the Detroit Tank Arsenal in March of 1944. It had arrived in France in July. It had fought through Normandy, through the hedgerows, through villages with names nobody could pronounce. The tank had a name painted on the barrel, Iron Lady. The crew had painted it after their first engagement. They thought it would bring luck. It didn't bring luck. It brought German shells. The first hit had come during a withdrawal near Nancy, an 88mm round from a concealed anti-tank gun. The shell struck the front glacis plate at an angle, penetrated, killed the driver, set the fuel tank smoking. The second hit came 30 seconds later. Same gun. Hit the turret front. Didn't penetrate but cracked the armor and jammed the turret ring. The third hit came as the crew was bailing out. Struck the engine deck. Penetrated the thin top armor. Shrapnel shredded the engine compartment. The crew survived by seconds. The tank burned for an hour before the fire suppressed itself. Recovery crews had pulled it back to the maintenance area 2 days later, tagged it for salvage. Nobody even considered repair. Now Donovan crawled underneath the hull with a flashlight. The mud was cold. The space between the tank's belly and the ground was barely wide enough for a man. He checked the transmission. The casing was cracked. Internal gears were stripped, but the mounting points were intact. The drive shaft was bent but not broken. He crawled out, circled to the left side. The track lay in the mud like a dead snake, broken pins, shattered links. But only about 15 feet of the track was destroyed. The rest was intact. The suspension was bent. The bogies were damaged, but the torsion bars seemed okay. The return rollers could be salvaged from other wrecks. He climbed onto the engine deck, pulled open the damaged hatches. The engine was a mess. Shrapnel had torn through cooling lines and electrical systems. The air filters were destroyed. Oil had leaked everywhere. But the engine block itself was intact. The cylinders were undamaged. The crankshaft turned when he tested it. He moved to the turret. The exterior was scorched. The gun barrel had a slight bend from thermal stress. The periscopes were shattered. But when he manually rotated the turret, it moved slowly, grinding. But it moved. He dropped inside through the commander's hatch. The interior smelled of smoke and chemicals. The radios were destroyed. The gun controls were damaged. Blood had dried on the floor where the driver had been hit. But the gun breech was functional. The recoil mechanism worked. The ammunition storage racks were empty but undamaged. He spent 3 hours examining every system, making notes, sketching diagrams, running through scenarios in his head. By regulation, this tank was a total loss. The armor was compromised. The engine was damaged. The transmission was destroyed. The turret was jammed. The track was broken. No reasonable mechanic would attempt repair, but Donovan wasn't thinking about repair. He was thinking about transformation. The armor was compromised, but the holes could be patched, reinforced, maybe even strengthened if he thought about it differently. The engine was damaged, but the damage was to accessories. The core was sound. The transmission was destroyed, but there were 3 other destroyed Shermans in the salvage yard. One of them had an intact transmission. The track was broken, but track could be scavenged and rebuilt. He climbed out of the tank as the sun was setting. His uniform was covered in oil and mud. His hands were black. His notebook was full of calculations. Captain Harris walked over. "Well?" "It's savable," Donovan said. "Savable how? Half the systems are destroyed. Half are destroyed, half are intact. I take the intact half and rebuild around it." "That's not how tanks work, Sergeant." "Maybe it should be." Harris looked at the wreck, looked at Donovan, shook his head. 48 hours, that's all you get. After that we strip it, whether you're done or not. Donovan nodded. 48 hours. He needed to start immediately. Donovan sat in the maintenance tent with his notebook open. Rain drummed on the canvas above. A kerosene lamp threw shadows across the pages he had been sketching for 2 hours, working through the engineering problems one by one. The standard approach to tank repair was restoration. You tried to return the machine to its factory condition. You replaced damaged components with identical parts. You followed the technical manual. You maintained specifications. That approach required parts that didn't exist, and time he didn't have. So Donovan was designing something else, not a restoration, a transformation. The armor problem was actually an opportunity. The 3 penetrations had proven where the Sherman was vulnerable. The front glacis at certain angles. The turret face under direct hits, the engine deck from above, but they had also proven where the armor held the side plates had deflected several hits. The lower hull was untouched. The gun mantlet had stopped fragments. Instead of trying to fix the damaged armor, he would reinforce its scavenged steel plate from destroyed tanks. Weld it over the penetrations. Add extra layers at the vulnerable angles. It would add weight. It would slow the tank, but it would also make it much harder to kill. The engine damage was fixable. The accessories could be replaced with parts from other wrecks. The cooling system could be rerouted. The electrical system could be simplified. He would strip out everything non-essential and focus on making the engine reliable rather than powerful. The transmission was the big problem. The destroyed unit would need complete replacement. But the salvage yard had a transmission from a tank that had thrown a track and burned. The casing was scorched, but the internals were intact. He could install it. It wouldn't be elegant. It would require custom mounts and probably violate a dozen engineering standards, but it would work. The track was straightforward. Scavenge links from multiple sources. Rebuild the damaged sections. Reinforce the weak points. The turret was where it got interesting. The jammed turret ring would take too long to properly repair, but he didn't need it to rotate quickly. He needed it to rotate enough. If he manually freed the worst of the damage and added a hand crank backup system, the crew could still aim slowly, but they could aim. The modifications would create something strange. A Sherman that was heavier and slower than standard. A Sherman with improvised armor and simplified systems. A Sherman that looked like it had been assembled from parts of 3 different tanks. Because it would be assembled from parts of 3 different tanks, Corporal Eddie Morrison walked into the tent. He was Donovan's assistant. A kid from Tennessee who had learned mechanics working on moonshine stills. "You really gonna try this, Sarge?" "Already started." "Captain Harris thinks you're crazy." "Captain Harris is probably right." Morrison looked at the sketches. "This ain't gonna be a normal tank when you're done." "Normal tanks are getting killed," Donovan said. "Maybe we need something that isn't normal." "What if it doesn't work? What if you put all this time in and it just falls apart?" "Then we strip it. For parts like the captain wanted. We lose 2 days. That's all. And if it does work..." Donovan closed the notebook. "If it works, we get 1 more tank in the field, 1 more gun supporting the infantry. 1 more chance for some crew to make it home." Morrison nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "Get the cutting torches. Get the welding gear. Find every piece of plate steel in the salvage yard. And get me that transmission from the burned-out Sherman at the end of the row. That's gonna take all night. We've got 46 hours left. We don't sleep until it's done. Morrison left. Donovan stood and put on his jacket. The rain had not stopped. He thought about what he was about to do, thought about the regulations he would break, the procedures he would violate, the risk he was taking with time and resources. Then he thought about the alternative. Another tank stripped for parts. Another crew going into battle undermanned. Another day of watching machines die because nobody would try something different. He picked up his wrench and walked out into the rain. 2 in the morning. The rain had stopped, but the cold remained. Donovan stood beside the Sherman with a welding torch in his hand. Sparks showered down onto the wet ground. The metal glowed orange where he was attaching a steel plate over one of the penetration holes. Morrison worked on the other side, cutting armor from a destroyed tank. The cutting torch screamed. Metal fell away in sections. 3 other mechanics had volunteered to help. They worked on the track. On the engine, on the transmission that lay in pieces waiting to be installed. The compound generator hummed in the background. Work lights threw harsh shadows. The whole scene looked like something from a junkyard, not a military repair operation. Donovan's hands ached. His eyes burned from the welding flash. His back hurt from hours of bending over the tank. But he kept working. The armor reinforcement was taking shape. He had scavenged plate steel from 3 different wrecks, cut it to fit the penetrations and the weak points, welded it in place at angles designed to deflect rather than stop. It was ugly, the welds were rough, the plates didn't match. But it was thick. Where the front glasses had been a single layer of rolled, homogeneous armor, there were now 2 layers with a gap between them. The gap would help dissipate the energy of a hit. He hoped the extra armor added weight, a lot of weight. The tank would be slower, less maneuverable, but it would be harder to kill. If it didn't break down from the added stress, if the improvised transmission could handle the load, if the patched engine didn't overheat, if any of this actually worked. Donovan stepped back and looked at what he had created. It didn't look like a Sherman anymore. It looked like something assembled from scrap of Frankenstein machine. Morrison walked over. His face was black with soot. Transmissions mounted. Not pretty, but it's in. Engines got cooling lines rerouted, should run. Tracks rebuilt on the left side. We're testing the tension now. Turret. Freed up the ring. Still stiff, but it rotates. Guns good. Optics are mostly shot, but the main sight works. Donovan nodded. They were making progress. But dawn was coming. They had maybe 6 more hours before Captain Harris would call time. "What do you think?" Morrison asked. "I think we're about to find out if I'm a genius or an idiot." Could be both. Could be. They went back to work. Donovan climbed inside the turret, started reconnecting the electrical systems he had simplified. The fire control system was gone. The radio was gone. Everything non-essential was gone. What remained was brutal simplicity. Engine, gun, armor, crew. He thought about the manual, thought about all the regulations he had broken in the past 10 hours, thought about what would happen if he was wrong. But he also thought about what would happen if he was right. A tank was just a machine. A machine existed to perform a function. If you changed what the machine was supposed to do, you could change how it was built. This Sherman would never be fast again. It would never match factory specifications. It would never pass an inspection. But it might survive what a factory Sherman could not. The welding torch hissed. The generator hummed. The work continued through what remained of the night. By dawn, the modifications were complete. Time to see if any of it actually worked. The modified Sherman sat in the morning light, looking like no tank that had ever left a factory. The armor was layered and patched. Welds showed where plates had been added. The surface was rough, unpainted, the metal still showing scorch marks and impact damage that had been reinforced rather than repaired. The left track was a patchwork of links from 4 different sources. Some were darker, some were bent and straightened, but they held together. The engine deck had been simplified, cooling vents rerouted, access panels replaced with improvised covers. Everything designed for function rather than appearance. The turret showed the worst of the modifications. The rotation was manual in places where hydraulics had failed. The periscopes were mismatched. The commander's cupola was slightly crooked from being remounted. Captain Harris walked around the tank 3 times without speaking. Finally, he stopped. Looked at Donovan. "This is what you built in 48 hours?" "Yes, sir." "It looks like something that should be in a junkyard." "It's functional." "Is it? Have you even tried to start it?" Donovan climbed onto the hull, dropped through the driver's hatch. Morrison got in the assistant driver's position. 2 other mechanics climbed into the turret. Donovan hit the starter. The engine coughed. Died. He tried again. It coughed, caught, roared to life. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The whole tank shuddered. But the engine ran. Donovan tested the controls. The clutch was stiff. The transmission made grinding noises, but it engaged. The tank lurched forward. Slowly, much slower than a standard Sherman. But it moved. He drove it in a circle. The added weight made it sluggish, the improvised track through mud. The engine temperature climbed faster than it should have. But everything worked. He brought it back to where Captain Harris stood, shut it down. Harris climbed up, looked inside, looked at the improvised controls, the simplified systems, the rough welds visible from the interior. "It's a mess, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." "The Army will never approve this for combat." "I'm not asking for approval, sir. I'm asking for a chance to prove it works." Harris was quiet for a moment, then he climbed down. "There's a supply run tomorrow, convoy of 6 tanks escort duty. We're short 1 tank because of mechanical issues. You want to prove this thing works, that's your chance. If it breaks down, you tow it back and strip it for parts like I wanted. If it performs, maybe I don't court-martial you for destroying 3 tanks worth of salvageable components." "Understood, sir." Harris walked away. Morrison climbed out of the tank. "Supply run," he said. "That's not combat." "It's a test," Donovan replied. "See if the systems hold together under load. See if the armor modifications don't crack. See if the engine can run for more than 10 minutes without overheating. And if it fails, then we tried. That's more than most people can say." They spent the rest of the day making adjustments, tightening bolts, checking welds, running the engine and watching temperatures, testing the turret rotation, loading ammunition. By evening, the tank was as ready as it would ever be. Donovan stood beside it as the sun set, ran his hand over the rough armor, felt the welds, looked at the patches. It was ugly, it was improvised, it violated every standard, but it was alive. A machine that had been dead 2 days ago now ran, moved, could fight. Whether it could survive was another question. Tomorrow would tell. The convoy moved out at dawn, 6 Shermans, 4 supply trucks, a reconnaissance element ahead and behind. The route ran through 40 miles of contested territory, not an active combat zone, but not safe. German stragglers, isolated strongpoints, the occasional patrol. Donovan drove the modified Sherman at the rear of the column. Morrison rode as gunner. 2 other mechanics filled out the crew. They had volunteered. Nobody forced them. The tank ran rough. The engine temperature stayed high. The transmission made noises that would make any normal mechanic shut it down for inspection. But it ran. The added weight was obvious. The other Shermans pulled ahead easily, Donovan had to push the engine to keep up. The modified armor made the whole machine feel sluggish, heavy, like driving a tank with half its parts replaced by concrete, which essentially he was. The morning passed without incident. The convoy made good time. The road was mud, but passable. The sky stayed grey and low. Then around noon, the column entered a section of road that ran through a forest. Tall trees on both sides. Limited visibility. The kind of terrain every tank commander hated. The radio crackled. Lead tank reporting movement ahead. The column slowed. Donovan brought his tank to a halt. Scanned the tree line. Saw nothing. Then the world exploded. The ambush came from both sides simultaneously. German anti-tank guns positioned in the trees. At least 4 guns, maybe more. The first round hit the lead Sherman in the side, penetrated. The tank shuddered and stopped moving. The second round hit one of the supply trucks. The truck exploded. The convoy tried to return fire, tried to move, but the road was narrow. The forest was thick. The tanks were bunched together in a killing zone. Another Sherman took a hit to the turret. The crew bailed out. Donovan saw the tactical situation in seconds. The convoy was trapped. The attacking guns were hidden. The only way out was forward or back. Both options meant running a gauntlet, unless someone could suppress the anti-tank positions long enough for the column to move. He keyed the radio. "This is Iron Lady. I'm moving to engage the guns on the east side. Cover the convoy withdrawal." Morrison looked at him. "We're gonna do what?" "We're gonna be a target." "That's insane." "Probably." Donovan gunned the engine. The modified Sherman lurched forward, turned toward the tree line where muzzle flashes showed enemy positions. The tank was slow. The enemy would have plenty of time to aim. But Donovan was betting on the armor modifications, betting that the improvised layers would do what they were designed to do. The first German round came in seconds later. It hit the front glacis at the exact spot where Donovan had welded 3 layers of scavenged plate. The impact was massive. The whole tank shook. Metal shrieked, but the round didn't penetrate. It gouged the armor, tore through the outer layer, but the angled second layer deflected it. The round skipped off and buried itself in the mud 20 feet away. Morrison fired back. The main gun roared high explosive into the tree line. Not accurate, but suppressive. A second German round came in, hit the turret front, right where the armor had been cracked and reinforced. Again the tank shuddered. Again the round failed to penetrate. The reinforced section held. Donovan kept driving forward, drew fire, drew attention. Gave the rest of the convoy time to reverse and regroup. A third hit, this one to the side armor, penetrated the outer layer. Stopped by the original armor beneath the interior filled with smoke. The crew coughed, but nobody was hit. Morrison kept firing. Loading and firing. The gun worked. The simplified systems worked. The modified Sherman absorbed punishment that would have destroyed a standard tank. The layered armor dissipated the energy. The angled plates deflected hits. As the crude welds held, it wasn't invulnerable, but it was survivable, and that made all the difference. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. 9 minutes of sustained anti-tank fire from 4 German guns. The modified Sherman took 7 hits total, 3 to the front glacis, 2 to the turret, 1 to the side, 1 to the engine deck. Not one penetrated completely. The outer armor layers were shredded. The welds Donovan had made in the dark were cracked and torn. The paint was burned off. The metal was scored and gouged. But the crew was alive. The tank was functional, and the convoy had escaped the killing zone. Donovan backed the Sherman away from the tree line. The German guns had stopped firing. Either they had withdrawn or they were out of ammunition. Either way, the ambush was over. He drove the tank back to where the convoy had regrouped, shut down the engine, climbed out. The other tank commanders gathered around, stared at the damage, stared at the crude armor that had somehow stopped 7 anti-tank rounds. Captain Harris walked up. Looked at the Sherman. Looked at Donovan. 7 hits, he said. Yes, sir. Standard armor would have been penetrated on the first or second hit. Yes, sir. Your modifications saved your crew. The modifications worked, sir. This time, Harris circled the tank, studied the damage pattern, the way the layered armor had absorbed and deflected impacts, the way the crude engineering had somehow performed better than factory specifications. How did you know? He asked. I didn't know, sir. I guessed. The armor was already compromised, so I had nothing to lose by adding more. The angle and spacing of the layers was based on impact patterns I'd seen on other tanks. I just applied the same principles. This isn't standard procedure. No, sir, it isn't. The manual doesn't cover anything like this. The manual doesn't cover a lot of things, sir. Harris nodded slowly. Get it running again. We still need to complete the supply run. It's still running, sir. Engines hot but functional. We can move. The convoy reformed. The damaged tanks were left for recovery. The modified Sherman took point this time. If there were more ambushes, Donovan's tank would meet them first. There were no more ambushes. They reached the supply depot by evening, delivered their cargo, turned around and made the return journey without incident. By the time they got back to base, word had spread. The mechanics gathered around the modified Sherman, examined the damage, studied how the armor had performed. One of them counted the impact marks. 7 direct hits from anti-tank guns. 7 failures to penetrate. They started calling it the Iron Turtle, too slow to chase, too tough to kill. Donovan spent the next 3 days repairing the damage, replacing the torn outer armor, rewelding the cracked plates. The second time around, he worked faster. He understood the principles better now. Other mechanics started asking questions. How had he angled the plates? How much space in between layers? What kind of welds worked best? He showed them, explained his reasoning, the physics of deflection, the way layered armor dissipated energy, the compromises between weight and protection. Within a week, 3 other damaged Shermans were being modified using similar principles. Not identical to Donovan's design, but based on the same ideas. The modified tanks were slower, uglier. They violated specifications. But they were harder to kill. And on a battlefield where American armor was outgunned, survivability mattered more than perfection. The war in Europe ended 7 months later, May 1945. Germany surrendered. The fighting stopped. Sergeant Mike Donovan returned to Iowa in August. He went back to fixing tractors. The farm was still struggling. Some things never changed. He didn't talk much about the war. When people asked, he said he had been a mechanic, fixed tanks. Nothing special. The modified Sherman never made it into official reports. No awards were given for improvised armor modifications. No engineering papers were written about layered plate theory applied in field conditions. The tank itself was scrapped after the war, melted down with thousands of other Shermans turned into steel for peacetime manufacturing. But the ideas survived. Other mechanics who had seen Donovan's work remembered the principles. Some of them stayed in the army after the war, became engineers, designers. The next generation of armor specialists, the concept of layered armor, spaced armor, composite protection. These became standard in later tank designs. Not because of one modified Sherman in France, but because someone had proven the concept worked. In Donovan's garage in Iowa, there was a photograph on the wall. Black and white, taken by Morrison before the convoy mission. It showed the modified Sherman ugly and rough, scarred and patched. Underneath the photo, Morrison had written, "Iron Turtle, took 7 hits, brought everyone home." Donovan looked at that photo sometimes when he was working late, remembered the 2 days of welding in the rain, remembered the ambush, remembered the sound of shells hitting armor that should have failed but didn't. He never told anyone that he still had the notebook, the one with all the sketches and calculations, the improvised engineering that had saved 4 lives in a forest in France. It sat in a drawer, pages stained with oil and dirt, filled with diagrams that violated every regulation. Sometimes he flipped through it, remembered what it felt like to look at a broken machine and see possibility instead of scrap. The army had taught him to follow manuals. The war had taught him when to ignore them. That lesson stayed with him. In the way he approached every broken tractor, every impossible repair, every problem that looked unsolvable until you stopped thinking about what you were supposed to do and started thinking about what actually needed doing. Wars are won by new factories and superior production, by logistics and strategy and numbers, but sometimes they are won by one mechanic with a welding torch who refused to accept that a dead machine had to stay dead. The modified Sherman had been ugly, improvised, against regulations, but it had worked, and 4 men who should have died in a German ambush had lived to go home. That was engineering enough.